Hello, and welcome to another episode of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. um, I am preparing to go talk to a class about creating a story from scratch. One of the things that they're learning is about the different types of conflict, and it just reminded me of all the different lessons that I had um, growing up about the different types of conflict. We used to call it man versus fill in the blank, which is clearly doesn't work for 2019. So person versus, back in the ancient days when I was in school, that's how we used to phrase it. Man versus self, and man versus nature, and man versus man. But person versus self, person versus nature, person versus person. Um, and I want to talk about what I would consider a better way of really thinking about it from the perspective of a writer. I do understand why teachers will teach it that way. For reading, makes perfect sense to teach it that way for reading and understanding the different components of the story. But a lot of the times in just my history of taking writing classes, a lot of writing teachers, fiction writing teachers, will still teach it that way, which is an ineffective way to teach it. Is what I call the taxonomic method of teaching story elements. And you can apply that to pretty much any other story element. It's an ineffective way to teach how the story works to someone who's actually writing the story, especially beginning readers, grade school, high school, whatever. It's a fine way to break it down. You can learn a lot of things taxonomically, but very frequently in writing classes, they'll have whole lessons that will be just, here's how you could do it, here's another way you could do it, here's another way you could do it, which has some really minimal value, but is essentially a shallow way to teach the actual writing. And not as a criticism to anybody who teaches it that way, or who teaches reading that way. But ultimately, in terms of creating a piece, it ends up being a really shallow way of understanding just how conflict works. I think a more effective way of understanding, the taxonomy of conflict, is recognizing essentially that all of them really boil down to one. I think when you're talking about teaching how to write, the aim is not to look at all of the possibilities, but to look at how those possibilities work and what's really at the root of them to come up with what would really be a genuine universal. I've encountered a lot of false universals, but if you are able to come up with and justify a genuine universal, it's much more effective. And with conflict, what I would argue is that the person versus, what have you, or, in the ancient times, man versus whatever, the what's really at the root of that is that all of them really are just person versus self, ultimately. And that's what I tend to recommend just for early beginning writers, is to recognize, if you have, start with a character. If you recognize what the character's motivation is, what's the opposite motivation? If the character wants something, what's the opposite motivation that keeps the character from actually achieving what they want? And so if you look at, some of the common examples, I was just scanning through a bunch of different examples of the different types of conflict. Each of them identifies this particular conflict happening in the story, but at the root of all of those conflicts is still person versus self. So, the examples that they tend to use of person versus self are like Hamlet. I mean, obviously, very, very introspective. His conflict is that he has this duty to seek revenge, but he, is hesitant to do that. You can see that conflict and that kind of conflict, or that sort of dynamic playing out in pretty much all of the examples, some sort of version of that. And the person versus person examples that they use, a lot of heroic examples. Jean Valjean, I saw one that used Jean Valjean versus Javert. But what is Jean Valjean's in Les Mis? What is, if you're not familiar, if I say Jean Valjean, you're not familiar, by the way, that's from Les Mis. I'm sure that clarifies it even more than what you didn't already know. But what is his conflict? His conflict was with Javert, but his conflict is still ultimately internal. His duty to others versus his self-preservation. He's an escaped prisoner, but he keeps because he's noble and selfless and all this. He keeps outing himself, and he keeps doing all these things for other people that run the risk of him getting caught by Javert again. Javert has similar sort of opposite direction, sense of duty that drives him to do these crazy obsessive things that go really overboard in completion of his duty, but still ultimately he's able to recognize, at least by the end, he's able to recognize that he has gone too far over time. But you can look at that with person versus nature and the examples that they give. And a lot of these, the obvious one being Moby Dick. Moby Dick and Old Man in the Sea kind of function in a similar way. What's the conflict in Moby Dick? It's similar to Javert in many ways. Except it's not duty. It's just obsession with conquering this thing that is more powerful than Ahab. And there's so many ways to read it, of course, famously. But is the conflict really between Ahab and Moby Dick? Ultimately, it is still, at its core, is still doing this self-destructive thing in order to complete this obsessive need to destroy this thing that's more powerful. And you see that version of that sort of motivation, that sort of conflict a lot, is if you're trying to destroy something that's more powerful than you, ultimately that's a manifestation of insecurity. Ahab is deeply insecure. As I said, thousands of ways to read that book famously. But he's a deeply insecure character. So he acts against self-interest and interest of his crew in order to complete this obsession with destroying this really powerful thing. So it's an internal conflict, essentially. And you expand out from that, you can say person versus society, and they give examples like Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye, obviously, when Holden Caulfield talks about phonies, is it a legitimate conflict with society? Yeah, arguably. Holden Caulfield is a pretty extreme example of this, but is he really having a conflict with society? If he's identifying phonies everywhere, is that really a problem with people outside of Holden, or is that Holden's problem? Clearly, that's Holden's problem. But still, ultimately, when there are legitimate societal problems that somebody's fighting against, the emotional dynamic of the story is choosing to fight against those societal problems, or choosing to conform to them, choosing to play the game of the society, or choosing to resist it. And that's still ultimately an internal conflict. And the parallels a lot of the nature conflict, and the nature conflicts a lot of the times are survival stories. I referenced Hatchet by Gary Paulson just randomly in a story not that long ago. And any sort of survival story, if you think of like Lord of the Flies, real common story to read, high school level, has a very important character named Simon, so I appreciate that. Any sort of survival story, what's the ultimate conflict? Outwardly, yeah, it's a conflict with the forces of nature that the person is struggling to survive in. But the internal conflict frequently is fighting against these natural forces or succumbing to the natural forces, just letting go of that resistance and just, letting the natural forces kill you. One of them used Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Janie and Their Eyes Were Watching God has all these different conflicts. But what is her internal conflict? Her lack of power. She strives to achieve power. So that's person versus person conflict. That's person versus nature conflict. That's person versus society conflict. It's got all those conflicts. And so, what's so powerful about that final image of her surviving? Because she faced so many different things that were challenge to her ability to survive, and she still survived them. So we have this heroic moment of this person that has so little power against all of these different forces, natural forces. Her husband gets rabies of all the plot twists. How can she really control that? Well, she still survives. She still stays strong, despite all of these conflicts. And that's really an internal conflict. What's really emotionally resonant about that is her internal conflict. And you have person versus fate, which, a lot of them reference Greek tragedies, and there's plenty of writing about that. And so, and just classically look at what does Aristotle say about Oedipus? What is really emotionally resonant about Oedipus's conflict? It's that it comes down to his hubris. It's not that ultimately fate is the actual conflict he has. The conflict he has is his arrogant inability to recognize the problems he's actually having. And I saw one that referenced Slaughterhouse-Five, and I don't know that Slaughterhouse-Five is necessarily a conflict of fate. He knows his future. Billy Pilgrim knows his future. But there are very few moments where he's resisting the future, if I remember correctly. I do love that book, but it has been a while. But that did not stand out to me at all about that book, that he was trying to resist his fate or resist his future. I don't know. It's really, Billy Pilgrim is struggling with all these complex emotions from having been part of the Dresden bombing, and trying to manage his life and hold his life together. That's much more significant part of that story. I'm not sure why that would be person versus fate necessarily. And then you have person versus the unknown or the supernatural. And a couple of the examples that they used were like The Shining. I mean, The Shining, definitely. Pretty extreme example of that, but The Shining is definitely an internal conflict. But any sort of supernatural conflict is somewhat similar to the nature conflict, where your response to the supernatural conflict is the much more emotionally resonant thing, and the supernatural element can certainly elicit the emotion of a sense of the uncanny or the mysterious. But and certainly The Shining achieves that. But how does Jack respond to that? In a very, very bad way, and then it becomes person versus person conflict. And another one that they reference, I'm not sure I covered all of them, but another one that they reference is person versus machinery, which is a relatively new one. And there's a lot you could pull out of that in terms of dehumanization and what have you. Part of the conflict is the convenience of machinery, the human ingenuity that leads to the advancement of society through machinery that gives us all of these conveniences. So do we let go of our own humanity and cede it over to the computers? And that will manifest as things like, the reference they always make in a lot of or the reference they frequently make in a lot of those is to Terminator, which is a different sort of, I would argue that's really just person versus person, arguably. But the whole idea that the machines take over, I would say at the core of that is something I've talked about before: subjecthood versus objecthood. A character who's really rich and emotionally resonant is going to be a subject, making their own decisions and functioning essentially independently as a character. So, if you create an effective character who is a subject, they'll go outside of the author's control, really, and just allow the character to act freely of their own accord, really. And so a person versus machinery sort of conflict is externalizing that same basic conflict of being independent, freely acting person, a subject, not controlled by someone else, or being an object, being treated as an object by someone else, and trying to eliminate that sort of conflict. And you can see, similar sort of thing in the person versus society conflict. but at the core of it is, the desire to be treated as a subject, the desire to have control, like Janie and their eyes were watching God, the desire to have control over yourself versus all of these other forces that are attempting to control you, that's externalized in the form of robots and machines and what have you. So, robots tend to have lots and lots of resonances in that basic conflict of subjecthood versus objecthood, but still ultimately that's person versus self is still ultimately at the root of that. So, recognizing at the core of character creation, character development, is still ultimately recognizing the paradoxes of conflict, recognizing how somebody's motivation can meet resistance from the opposite motivation. And still ultimately at the core of pretty much any conflict. Other conflicts are essentially just layers on top of that, just extensions from that. This is why I tend to like to talk about these things in terms of a spectrum, like the rainbow circle. You have the center sort of value, and you have radiances out from that center value. So in this case, the center value would be person versus self. That's at the core of any sort of conflict. And you can layer on top of that, person versus self reflects into person versus nature or person versus society. Still at the core of it is that essential value. And so that's one of the problems I have with the taxonomics approach. If you're trying to teach a young writer how to write, teaching how to read, certainly you can identify taxonomically. Here are all the different conflicts that I can read out of this. Here are multiple conflicts I can read out of this particular piece. Yeah, that's totally fine as a reader. But if you're teaching to write from this taxonomic approach, and you said different conflicts you can choose are person versus nature, or person versus society, or person versus person. If somebody just goes from that perspective and says, "Oh, I want to do person versus person," it could end up being very shallow and not really emotionally resonant. To have just that sort of superficial concept. A lot of those, if you divorce it from everything at its core being person versus self, person versus person without that person versus self at the core of it is kind of a shallow way of thinking about conflict. Or person versus nature without that person versus self at the core of it, it's just going to be shallow. Is the person going to defeat nature? Well, no. Well, why should I care if somebody's not really a human being? If somebody doesn't have those deeper level internal conflicts, there's fewer ways to really care, fewer reasons to really care about the character. Those are, I think, better ways to really think about the taxonomy of conflict than just to look at the different categories of possibilities of things you can do. But you can think about any sort of story element like that. Plenty of, creative writing textbooks will just list everything that you can do. But what's really at the core of all of those, what's the core value ultimately? And that's a lot of the times that's what's missing, unfortunately. But anyway, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you on the next episode.